All right, and we're live this Sunday, May 14th. This is Federico Lines of States Rights Radio.
And Seth Hancock of Seth Hancock Reports.
And this is Restoring the Constitution. Tonight's episode is the clear definition of Article 1, Section 8, Uniform Rule of Naturalization. Who has the power to establish and who has the power to enforce? And among other issues consisting in this article. So, Seth, I'm going to read on Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. When I read this, Seth, and to my listeners, I think Congress has the power to establish the rule, but it is a sovereign state who has the power to enforce this rule, this rule of naturalization and immigration. What say you, Seth?
Well, yeah, I would generally agree. I mean, it's like so many of the laws that we think about is that law enforcement is really an activity of local government and some state. I know you have state police as well, and that's really who's supposed to be enforcing the laws. And laws should be written closest to the people, and that means the local and state authorities writing most of the laws. And yeah, Congress can set up some certain rules around it on how the laws should be written, but the federal government's supposed to have a very silent role, kind of setting up the principles of naturalization, I guess I'd say, and then the states kind of go with that principle.
Yeah, I've been reading, and also consists of my first book, State Sovereignty, the Power Lies with Us and Not the Federal Government, which mainly pertains on the rule of naturalization. And, in 1851, the city of New York had its own rule of naturalization, their own rule of entering immigrants into the port of New York and becoming residents or legal residents or citizens based in the state of New York. And I've always now stated that if it wasn't for a very bad Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Roger Taney, and if he would never have denied the right of the state of Wisconsin to give citizenship papers and naturalization papers to an individual by the name of Dred Scott, I don't believe that this country would have suffered that massive of a civil war. But sadly, you had an arrogant Chief Justice, Southern Chief Justice, that was more for his special interest rather than the interest of the Constitution. And he just wanted to put down anybody that, was not pivot to his agreement. So I always believe that the federal government has established this clause, but this is a constitution by the states. This is a constitution that was made by the states to retain their sovereignty. And here you have somebody saying, no, you can't do that. Wisconsin, you're not allowed to do that. Yada yada yada, and that's why we're in the mess that we're in, thanks to Roger Taney. So, do you have any examples of that, Seth, or anything about that?
I guess, what happens when, the federal government takes it on its role in this is we get things like this week, the Republicans passing the E-Verify, part of a bigger bill, which, I know there's several different things in their immigration bill, which, who's to say whether it passes the Senate or not, but E-Verify is just this garbage, basically Orwellian, show me your papers type of bill. And it's just, this is what happens when you have a federal government that wants the power and control of everything, is that they demand we give them all this information on us, and we have to come to them to get permission to work. And I know there are a lot of people who view the border as there's a mess at the border, they believe, and I'm not on the border, so I don't know how bad it is, but I'll just say that, even if there is a problem, taking away all of our liberties is not the solution.
No, and you mentioned a point of that, Seth, is that you and I don't share a border. Our sovereign states don't share a border with Mexico or Canada. So that alone is not the responsibility of Florida or Illinois or Alabama or Virginia. So for the federal government to come in and says, "Oh, we're going to build a wall," that's an infrastructure spending. That should not. I don't want my federal tax dollars going to build a wall in Texas or Arizona. That's really not what we're about. So it's not Florida's responsibility. It's Texas' responsibility to control those borders, as well as Florida to control their coastal borders when we have refugees from Cuba or Venezuela come in. So and going back to recently on the E-Verify situation, yeah, it's a federal government program that increases on privacy rights, on ownership rights. That here in Florida, and the thing is that states are not here to cooperate with the federal government. They're not here to have allegiances or alliances with the federal government on that notion. So I don't see it. That's one flaw that I see with SB 1070 that happened in Arizona in 2010, where Arizona created their own immigration law, but yet they tied it with federal cooperation, and that's what kind of killed it. That's what Scalia dissented. Arizona may have the right to do an immigration law, but when you attach yourself with federal cooperation, like Florida did and other states are doing, you're kind of being contradictive in your policy.
Yeah, and that's kind of a theme of our show, whether we're talking about immigration or we're talking about abortion, whatever it is. That's how the states operate today. Is that they always tie their own legislations to the feds because they want the money that's going to come with following the dictates of the federal government, and that this is an attitude that has to stop. And it's the problem with our tax code. It's the problem with the 16th Amendment, where the federal government gets to tax our income and take all this money and create this beast of a system that has all the money and therefore has all the power and control. And here on this issue, immigration, that's led to you get Republican governors like Abbott and DeSantis who they do things like they ship illegals to like Martha's Vineyard, and all the conservatives they think you're owning the left when this is just a political game. It ain't solving any problems. It's it's just trying to score political points, and this is a problem with everything that's going on. Is every politician is looking to score political points, and they're creating more and more problems, left and right, Democrat, Republican. That's how they operate.
Yeah, and on that note, when Governor DeSantis with Abbott, they shipped illegal immigrants to Martha's Vineyard. I mean, and people were cheering that, and I go, no, wait a minute, hold on. The framers of the Constitution did not give this power to the state to play politics with. The framers of the Constitution gave this power to the states to defend their borders from immigration, from anything like that. The thing is that with the Mexican War, just one point that with the Mexican War in the beginning, the United States did not interfere with that Mexican, the pre-Mexican War with the Alamo and all that, because that was a problem with Texas. Texas was not part of the U.S. But then when the U.S. Congress declared war on Mexico, there you saw the federal government intervene and invade Mexico because it was a War Powers Act, but we'll get to that in a moment. But you mentioned something about, the theme of our shows, where many sovereign states have become dependent of the federal government. One, and whether if it's taxation or spending or whatnot. And in 2005, the Supreme Court heard a case of medical marijuana in the state of California. And I noticed that Scalia, may rest in peace, he sided with the liberal majority with the Commerce Clause and not with the dissenters, Clarence Thomas, and I don't know if Senator O'Connor was still there, but with Clarence Thomas. And the reason that Scalia sided with the liberals on this one is because that law in California did not have a clear intent of state sovereignty. It wanted to involve other states to come and enforce and come help out their law in California and also the federal government. And this is, the issue I have with these states. If you want to create medical marijuana or legalize marijuana in your state, fine by me. I don't care. As long as you don't involve other states and as long as you don't involve the federal government to come in and fund for your legislation, I don't have a beef on it. But you're right. That idea of that Gonzalez versus Wright ruling and that law in California, we've really made ourselves very dependable of the federal government, and it has to stop.
Yeah, and it's like we're talking about, the border, talking about immigration and stuff like that. And not every southern state, not every portion of the border is having a problem. I think of, I'd encourage listeners to look up Sheriff David Hathaway of Santa Cruz County in Arizona. And he's kind of like this very libertarian sheriff who is all about individual liberty. And I've heard him on interviews talking about he's down at the border of Nogales, where you have Mexico-Arizona border there. And, he says, we don't have a problem with the border here. And he's like, he'll admit that there might be problems at other portions of the border, but they don't have any problems with a lot of illegals coming in and stuff like that. And so why should people of Nogales in Arizona, why should they have to be funding problems at other parts when they seem to be doing a good job of with their border? So why are people being forced to pay for somebody else's problem?
Yeah, no, you're right there. And the outgoing Arizona governor, before he left, he proposed to the state legislature, and was either with legislative funds or an executive order the governor did. He built a wall with freight carriers, and as silly as it may be, it's Arizona's issue how he wants to spend that money. It's Arizona's legislative decision, and if they want to build a wall with freight carriers, with truck freight carriers or whatever, and did not receive a dime of the federal government, that's fine by me. But I don't think that they should propose in Congress either another illegal immigration amnesty bill or a illegal immigration enforcement law like they did with IRCA or with the 1996 immigration law, because that's an infringement of state sovereignty. That's giving Florida taxpayers, or even the border wall that Trump wanted to suggest, and I don't know if it ever got built. I don't think it ever got built, but the wall that he tries to suggest, again, that's a federal infrastructure. I don't believe in sending my money to California for a high-speed bullet train. Why should I send my money for a wall in Texas? It's an infrastructure. It's spending that is not for my state, and that's the issue that we've had, that many people, I remember when I was living in D.C. and I went to a party, to a book party of an individual who's a big Trumper, and I was outside. I didn't care to partake in their little Trump celebration, and they started chanting "Build our wall, build our wall," and I'm just shaking my head and really just laughing and crying inside, and saying to myself, "What a bunch of nincompoops! They just don't understand. They just want they just want this populist hero or this populist nationalist hero to take over." No, that's not how this country was established. And it's just very sad to see that we've really become dependent. And we really, you and I, have to tell our listeners and our followers and people out there to stop being dependent of the federal government.
Yeah, and the other thing is, first off, like with the wall, and I'm somebody who thinks that there probably are some border problems. I don't like the solutions coming from Washington. I never was a fan of the wall. It's going to cost a lot of money, and it's going to also require a lot of eminent domain, because there's a lot of private land on the border that the federal government's going to come in and basically steal property. I know they have to give some money to the landowners, but it's this massive program that's going to cost a lot of money. That's not going to really do anything to solve the problems that we're being told are happening because of this. And the whole thing is, I don't see the problem being the immigration. They always look at, they kind of target immigrants, and that's not the problem. The problem is our massive welfare state. The problem is our entitlement state, and nobody wants to do anything about that, and nobody's talking about that. We need to stop the entitlements and the welfare, not only for immigrants, but for American citizens, because there's always this fear that these immigrants are coming in and they're taking services away from American citizens. Well, American citizens nor immigrants I have this view that we're supposed to have liberty where we don't get services from government. We rely on ourselves to take care of ourselves. And, that's the real problem I see, is the entitlement state, the welfare state, and you can solve a lot of the problems that we're being told we have because of the immigration issue if we actually take care of the entitlement state and welfare state.
Oh no, you're right, and as you and I both agree, Seth, is that we don't want a welfare state for either legal or illegal citizens. We really don't. But sadly, we've seen this many times, and mostly many white individuals, mostly from poor southern states, benefit from this type of welfare state. You see in Louisiana, don't tell me that those senators from Louisiana don't get welfare funds for New Orleans and Baton Rouge and all that. And the same thing goes for Mississippi, Alabama, Virginia, West Virginia. So you're right. They only attack on immigrants, and they don't really attack the really source of problem, which is the entitlement state, the welfare state. That is a real problem. I don't believe that we should be. We're not entitled. It's not privileged under law. It's equality under law. No one is privileged within the Constitution, and that's the issue that we've had for many, many years, where it was the whites who had that privilege, mostly whites, and then it got changed to now minorities think they have that privilege. So, I know that Associate Justice Sonia Sotomayor wants to desperately write an opinion on privilege under law for minorities, as Justice Billings Brown did in Plessy versus Ferguson. She's just aching to write one, and I'm waiting for her to see that, because that's her dream, to make it privilege under law for minorities, illegal minorities, or just legal and legal minorities. And that's not how we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be equal under law. But one last point I want to make. Since the very after the first administration of George Washington came John Adams, and there we saw the first naturalization bill that the federal government tried to propose in 1798, and two Virginians decided to speak out against that. And that's where I focused on my writings and all that, is that the principles of 98 show that the federal government is not here to be our centrist papa. It's not there to protect us in any way. And Jefferson and Madison both said that this power of naturalization doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the states. And somehow, after the Civil War, it got changed, and now we saw in 1875 a California Republican pass the Chinese Exclusion Act. Who is the federal government to say that Chinese people are not allowed to come in here? What is this? I mean, this. If you want to see the problems, is the federal government restricting employment, immigration, culture differences. It is the federal government that is the one meddling and creating these issues, not the states.
Yeah, and it seems like they're creating problems, and then they're offering solutions that don't work, and when they don't work, they're going to provide a new solution. And meanwhile, this all entails taking more of our money to fund these new solutions. And it's almost like the game is rigged to work this way so that they can have excuses for taking more and more of our money to solve our problems when all they're doing is creating problems. And, if we get back to the understanding of the government, which I believe our government was set up to protect our liberties, not to solve problems. It's up to we the people to solve our own problems in our own lives and in our own communities. And it's just kind of a rigged game now. That's just both parties are using this rigged system to take more power and control.
No, yeah, you're right. You're right there, and it's a darn shame that people are not waking up to this and saying, who truly can we blame for really beginning the issue with the Civil War? Senator James Mason of Virginia, Chief Justice Roger Taney, who really denied the sovereign states of Pennsylvania. If they don't want to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, then they have all the right to not enforce it, and deny states the right of naturalized citizens, like in Wisconsin with Dred Scott. So it's always the federal government. And then you've had the Chinese Exclusion Act, you had the Muslim ban under Trump, you had the Japanese internment camps under FDR, you had the federal government deny 937 Jewish refugees to enter Florida. I've always said this, that, if the federal government wouldn't have interfered with the St. Louis in 1939, Florida, who had a Democrat Jewish governor before the St. Louis, I think Florida would have allowed the Jewish that boat to dock on Miami Harbor, or Port Everglades, and even New York would have done the same. But you have this federal government getting involved too much and overstanding their boundaries. And here comes the next topics that. This thing with borders, Trumpers and liberals have always said it's an international crisis. It belongs to the federal government. It's an invasion, and it's an armed invasion, or it's an invasion. They don't say it's an armed invasion. They just say it's an invasion. And this comes to the War Powers Clause. The War Powers Clause is very clear, and it's very clear that it's not really on domestic fronts, it's on international fronts, and that's our next topic for discussion, is the War Powers Clause.
Yeah, and obviously we've got the whole Russia-Ukraine thing going on, and but this is something that's been, the military-industrial complex has been butting America's nose into other nations' business for decades, for a century, and we've just we've lost the whole idea of national sovereignty because of this. We have, we go all the way back to Woodrow Wilson was the first president who talked about making the world safe for democracy and setting up this system where America is supposed to police the world. And we've completely lost how war is supposed to be declared. And, you got the Russia-Ukraine thing, and we're sending billions of dollars over to Ukraine. And if people really looked at it, and look, I'm not taking sides on this. I'm not saying Russia is some good actor. I'm saying, but Ukraine is no good actor either. It's and ultimately, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4 says, Clause 11 sets up the Congress must declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. And the Congress a long time ago abdicated its authority and duty and gave it to the presidency and to the executive branch. And the presidents, quite frankly, the presidents for a long time have been puppets, and they've set up, these bureaucracies, and we've got all these military bureaucracies that are really making the decisions, and they're unelected, and they're just meddling in the affairs of others. And they've completely dismissed the warnings of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who said, avoid entangling alliances. Thomas Jefferson said, friendship and trade with all, alliances with none. This is costing us a lot of money, but it's also costing our liberty, because when we go to war, we get things like the Patriot Act, which destroy our liberties here at home. And we need to get Congress to actually start doing its job again and debating these things, and not letting the presidency and the executive branch just take us to war willy-nilly, and deciding that, well, we're America, so we must have the best interests of the war. I mean, that's arrogance, and this attitude has to stop. Unfortunately, conservatives, because I was a big fan of George W. Bush at the time. I repent of that. We've kind of been taking over on the people on the right have been taking over on being the neocons, and they need to wake up. And I think there's some people waking up to it, but not enough.
No, and again, I also give my repentance to my support of W. Bush, and even way before W. Bush, he's just a continuing of this arrogance of the federal government, and has continued under Obama, Trump, and Biden. But I would say the beginning of this sense of arrogance, doesn't really. Woodrow Wilson was just a hypocrite, because in 1916 his campaign slogan was "He kept us out of war," and then 1917 he asked Congress for a declaration of war. But I would say the arrogance kind of started with the McKinley Republicans, the TR Republicans. This sense of imperialism, and that's where you get the charging of San Juan Hill and Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Philippines was once part of the U.S. government. The sense, imperialism. This, we broke away from the British Empire to get away from that very idea. And here you have Teddy Roosevelt, which I see many Republicans sing praises to this man. And I don't understand why. Wasting money on wars in Havana, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippines, where we could have been, spending money somewhere else. But yet again, I'm not saying spending money on railway back then because that's not the role of federal government. But but the things that's now I see that it attached although that war, the Spanish-American War, and then Congress tried to pass Tariffs Act and impose those tariffs onto the states, and that's what we have to be careful. Because Congress does have now the president has the authority to approve wars, and we've lost that since the Korean War, since the Vietnam War and Gulf War and et cetera, we've lost that constitutional principle of Congress approving wars. Now we see that presidents approve wars, and that is so wrong, and we need to stop that. But Congress has a right to approve those wars and go to war. And they have to find ways to pay for that war without putting that burden on the sovereign states, like they did. One thing I disagree with John C. Calhoun. Multiple issues I disagree with John C. Calhoun, but he kind of supported the 1816 Tariff Act after the War of 1812, a war that was approved by Congress and to stop an invasion from England. But later on, Congress passed the 1816 Tariff Act to pay for that burden of war expenses. That's fine, but it is the federal government who began that war, not the states of Louisiana or Florida or etc. So you can pass Tariffs Act, but just don't make them a direct taxation to the states. Make it an indirect taxation. Offer it to the loser of that war, England, to pay for that. So I don't believe that federal government has a right to place direct taxation to the states, and that's where we have a problem. Is that now they're putting this burden on us to pay for these wars for their own special interests, for their own special military operations, and the CIA for that matter. So. We really need to go back to the principles of who declares war and who has the power of the budget, and not to be a burden on us, on the states and the people.
Yeah, and the importance of this is, you go back, I think that World War II was the last legitimately declared war that we've ever been in. And ever since then, you look at Vietnam, you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, we get bogged down where there's no real objective that we know we're fighting for. And, when Congress declares war, they can set the parameters. This is what a win looks like, and then we can go in and get out. And, that's not what happens when you let the executive branch control these decisions. The objectives keep expanding. We go in. Initially, they sold the war on terror about going after the people who attacked us on 9/11. Which, quite frankly, I don't think that was ever the objective of that war. I think it was always about protecting oil, protecting the poppy fields in Afghanistan. It was, but that's what happens is, they sell the war for something that sounds legitimate to the people. And then it just keeps expanding. Now we need to rebuild Afghanistan and Iraq, and we need to create democracies there as if democracy is what we're supposed to be. That's another issue, that we're a republic, not a democracy. But whatever. The mission keeps expanding, and there's no way to ever win it. Which, when Congress is involved, they debate this. And they decide whether or not we should go to war. And if we decide to go to war, they can set the parameters. And then, obviously, the president, Article 2, lays out that the president is the commander-in-chief. And but the president is commander-in-chief once the Congress has given him that authority. but it's important that we debate these things and we don't just fearmonger and say, if we don't go to war, that these countries like Russia is going to come and take over America. Well, that's not going to happen. Let's be honest. But that's the importance of Congress declaring war. It can set up the parameters, and we can get the objective done as quickly as possible, and then stop the war, stop killing people, because that's what war is. People die in war. We should not be pro-war. We should, if we have to go to war, let's do it quickly and get out. But that's not what happens when it's the state that we're in today, where the executive branch is making all the decisions.
And that's an interesting point. After the end of Second World War, which again, the Second World War was a war declaration against Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and the Empire of Japan. And then when George S. Patton was in Berlin, he was desperately aching to go fight the Russians. Hey, I don't like the Russians as much as he did, but that's the thing is that, there was no war declaration against Russia. So as much as you hate the Russians back then, that also showed restraint because of a war declaration by Congress, legally, constitutionally. So after that, you've had generals in Southeast Asia not only fighting an objective in North Vietnam and South Vietnam, but also going into Laos and Cambodia and Burma and Thailand. And like, whoa, wait a minute! I thought the focus was just Vietnam, and here you have generals going into these other countries, and there was no congressional restraint. That is the problem that you and I see. But back in World War II, there was congressional restraint saying, hey, you stopped at Berlin, we're not going to go forward into Minsk or Moscow or Leningrad. That's it. We're done. We're not fighting again until Congress declares war. So, but yeah, there was a congressional restraint on the executive branch, which is under the Department of War, which is now the Department of Defense. But also, this narrative that the federal government creates, as you pointed out, Seth, even pre-war narratives and post-war or during war narratives, for example, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Who here will raise your hand to say that the United States did not know that Japan was on the verge to attack us? I always said that the United States, the higher-ups, George Marshall, FDR, they knew that the Japanese naval forces were going to attack Pearl Harbor because the air carriers left Pearl Harbor and went to Midway, went to San Diego. So you knew something was up. So that they create this narrative, oh my God, the Japanese bombed us, we have to go to war, and we did go to war. The same thing with the bombing of the USS Maine. It mysteriously exploded, and then later on Congress declared war. So they invent these narratives to put fear on the people, to declare war. Of course, it was done legally, fine, but they create these narratives to put fear, and these narratives doing to put fear, like the Nazis and the Vietnamese, the Chinese, the Russians. So, a central government likes to put fear onto its people, and people fall into that. And we saw that in 9/11 with the war on terror.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely, and I just want to go back to something you said, just kind of thinking about the Orwellian doublespeak, where they changed the name of it from Department of War to the Department of Defense. And the funny thing is, back when it was the Department of War, we still had a respect for the Constitution, whereas now we call it the Department of Defense, when there's no defense about it. It is today. It truly is a Department of War waging offensive wars on other countries. So it's the way they change the language just to because I'm all for defense. That sounds good. I'm against war though. So they change the names just to kind of propagandize and get people to support things that they shouldn't be supporting. But it's I always think about back even when I was still supportive of Iraq and Afghanistan, when I heard we were going to be rebuilding these nations and trying to make them democracies and stuff, and I supported that war because I saw planes fly into buildings here. I was all for going after the people who did that. But when I started hearing this nation building stuff going on, I started kind of at that time just kind of thinking, well, this is not the point of this. We've lost the whole idea of national sovereignty. And I always thought, this idea of going in and forcing democracy on people, well, that sounds antithetical. I mean, you can't force democracy, right? I mean, so I'm for war only when it's for defensive purposes. What we're doing is not for defensive purposes. It's to protect our interests. It's not to protect our interests, the people's interests. It's to protect the powers that be and their interests. And, I believe in national sovereignty, and you can't have national sovereignty if you don't respect the sovereignty of other nations. So, like, take Russia, Ukraine, for instance. My take is simply, this is not our fight. Let them hash out whatever they're going to hash out. That's over there. We need to take care of our own problems here in America. And, if we need to build up an army to defend ourselves because we're under attack, okay, that's when we do that. But, we're the aggressors now. America has been the biggest aggressor for over a century. And we need to get back to national sovereignty and taking care of our own problems here in America.
Well, on that, let me see. National sovereignty. I mean, when I saw the three planes crash on four planes actually, two on the World Trade Center, one in the Pentagon, and the other one in Pennsylvania in Shanksville, PA. I was angry. I was angry too. I was scared. But the way that the executive branch asked Congress for a resolution of defense, then is where I said, wait a minute, hold on. First of all, who are we going to go to war with? And why are we asking for a resolution? See, that's the thing, is that when you ask for a resolution, you're not asking for just a declaration. The resolution opens up for more, like you said, going to, like you and I both said, going into other countries, inflicting our pain into their pain, inflicting our so-called democracy into their political systems. And, I never forget, Hillary Clinton, she said in 1998 at a UN conference that China should be more involved to stop the human rights violations. Yeah, I abhor human rights violations. I really do. But I don't feel like I should tell China or Afghanistan how to treat their citizens, because that's not my concern. That's not, I mean, if Iran wants to bundle up their women or Afghanistan wants to bundle up their women, that's their problem. That's their prerogative, not mine. So when Congress creates these resolutions, they don't create restrainment, and they just go on and on with funding and funding on Afghanistan, funding in Turkestan and Pakistan and all that. And it just creates a haven of unlimited funds. And the thing of national sovereignty that's funny is that, I'm proud to be an American. I'm proud to be a citizen of this country. But the federal government was always supposed to be small. And even with wars like that, this thing of national sovereignty is, I don't want nationalism. I don't want to be proud of the federal government that's created this. But, here's one last question to you, Seth. the Second World War, the last war that Congress ever approved. Do you think that Harry S. Truman had the authority to drop the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Is that really? You think that should have gone through Congress for an approval?
That's a good question. That's a tough one because the war was declared, and so the president had the authority to make certain decisions then. So I guess I would say that he did have authority, but I'm open for discussion on that because I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and I read the declaration of war between the Empire of Japan. And yeah, Congress did give the authority for the president to declare war and send troops. But they also said, if I remember serves, and I need to look it up, and we can have a discussion on that later on, but of other means necessary. But, define other means necessary. I think that's what... I think if Truman wanted to really end the war... And I know he wanted to end the war quickly, but he ended the war too hastily that now we are in dangers of this nuclear arsenals all around the world, and that is very dangerous. I think if he would have opened that discussion in Congress would not have allowed that, and I think because again, one last thing, there was no need, in my opinion, to drop those two bombs. American forces were now on Japan's shores. They were on Okinawa. They were in other parts of Japan's territories, internal territories. They were just a few steps before reaching Tokyo. I don't believe that, if he would have been more constitutional, Harry Truman, and involved Congress in it, Congress would have said no, and Congress would have said just, finish it, get to Tokyo, and just bomb like you bombed Berlin and bomb Tokyo, and that was means. But that's for another discussion on that, because I truly don't believe that Truman really had the authority to do that.
Yeah, that's an interesting discussion. I'd have to go back and look at exactly what the Declaration of War stated, but. Those are interesting discussions to kind of hash out what constitutional authority was actually given.
Exactly. So, on this note, Seth, do you have any last notes on the Naturalization Clause? Who has a right to enforce and the War Powers Clause?
I guess the only thing I can say is read the Constitution and. Get an idea of what authority they actually have. And it's not, they don't have complete authority in the federal government. Read the Constitution, especially people who talk a big game about loving the Constitution. Read it and figure out on those issues and others just what exact authority does the federal government have under our form of government.
Yeah, no, you're right. Not only read the Constitution, but read the framers who crafted the Constitution and who also did writings based on that. And I always say, Seth, read the Principles of 1798, Thomas Jefferson's Resolution of Kentucky and James Madison's Resolution of Virginia. Against truly the first Naturalization Act of the federal government. Because those principles should come alive and should dictate that it is not up to the federal government to dictate naturalization onto the states. So I would say read not only the Constitution, but read also those writings that would open up people's minds.
Yeah.
So
yeah, definitely. Yeah, not only read the founding documents, but read what the founders who framed these documents, so what their other writings said, because that gives you an idea of why they wrote the Constitution the way they did.
Exactly. Good point there. So anyway, to our dear listeners and followers, thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back next Sunday. And Seth, always a pleasure in having these discussions with you.
Yeah, always fun.
All right. Have yourself a great night, and we'll talk later.
Yep. Good night.